Greetings viewers, welcome to my CSS tutorial part 1 of 2. For this tutorial you are required to know HTML. If you don't, check out my 2-part HTML series in the description. CSS tells the web page which elements should look like what. Not sure what I mean? Continue watching to learn how. Alright, before we jump into the tutorial about CSS and get into some coding, some theory needs to be covered. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. It is a language that tells the web page how elements should look. Should buttons have borders, have a background color of red, how large should they be, and it allows for standardized styling, which means that it'll apply across different elements and you don't have to specify the style for each and every element. Now again, before we move on, there are 3 types of CSS, which actually what I would mean by that is there are 3 ways to implement CSS in your web page. Internal, external, and inline. Keep that in mind, it's going to be important. So let me just breeze through these different types. So the first type, which is internal, or any order in that matter, internal, is where you put your code in between a style tag. Now as you can see over here, there's this style tag which I just produced out of Atom. Now this style tag can go anywhere in the web page, it can even go at the very bottom. But the thing is, it's recommended to put in the head, and all your CSS code goes here. CSS is a different language, remember that, okay? And the second, which is inline CSS, is basically defining the style of elements in the element itself. So let me just go to this paragraph tag, for example. In order to do that, I need to use a very specific attribute called style, and if I were to go inside here, I have to type in all my CSS over there. And the last type, which is called external CSS, it's not called, my mistake, is done through a different file. Now suppose you have multiple web pages and you want to use one file which defines how your page looks. Well, this is where you would use external CSS. So you put all your CSS code in here inside any .css file. Through convention, it is usually expected that you label your main CSS file as styles.css, although you can call it whatever you want. So here's my styles.css. Let me save the changes. Now you won't see anything change in the page, but this is how you would link to that specific file. So I would have to do that by using a special non-closing tag called link. So link rel equals styles sheet. Remember this is very important. Then we have href equals, now as you've seen href in the previous HTML tutorials, href is a reference to a file. So here, as you can see, styles.css is in the same file, so let me just put in the exact name. So that's how you link, and this link, the tag does not require any closing tag of any sort, making this a non-closing tag overall. So for this tutorial, we're just going to be doing internal CSS as I've explained, so let's get started then. Okay, so as I had explained, CSS is supposed to make things look prettier, explain or define in the web page what element should look like what. So to clear up any confusions, I've created a web page. As you can see over here, here's the code and here's the web page, just showcasing my interest in code, how I want to be a full stack developer. I've copied a paragraph over in order to to show you how CSS standardizes its styling. So let's jump straight into the code. So CSS consists of 2 fundamental parts, which is basically the selector and brackets. So let me show you what I mean. So suppose we want to define how the P element looks like. We want all P elements to have a color of, let's say, red, okay? So let me just show you how that's done, then I'll jump into the explanations. So you type in P, and it may not be very clear, but I have just opened up some curly braces. So P space, actually I don't think a space is required, and curly braces. In between these curly braces, all your attributes about elements would go in there. Now there's very specific prescribed attributes you can use. You cannot do what you feel like here, unfortunately. But let me just show you how to make all paragraphs have a color of red. So you type in color, which is actually the attribute name. So here the attribute name is color, and then what you want the value of that attribute to be. You can use hex colors using hashtag. You can use RGB colors with just basically red, green, blue, or you can even use commonly used color names like red, for example, as simple as that. Now let's take a look at what this looks like. Let me just reload the page, and if we go down, as you can see, all of this has turned red. Now as you can see, This is the selector. This basically tells CSS how to target the element. So as you can see over here, it is targeting the p tag. If you just straight away type in something over here, that becomes a tag that will be targeted, as that is how the selector works. Don't worry too much about selectors, but here's the more fun stuff you can do with CSS. So as you can see now, there's a semicolon towards the end, and that is very crucial. So, but the thing is, if I were to remove the semicolon at this point, you see nothing bad happens. But let's say I add another attribute and some other value. Just give me a moment. Now this attribute is going to do absolutely nothing because it's not been specified by CSS. Now if I remove a semicolon, because it's not the last attribute, it is just not going to work. So as long as the attribute is not the last attribute in the list, you don't need a semicolon. Right now you don't need one. Okay, so what else is there? Now that we've jumped into CSS, let's finally get into classes and IDs. Let's do this as fast as possible. So classes and IDs are used to categorize certain elements under a certain class or have a specific identification. As you've seen earlier in the anchor tag, you've seen the ID attribute in action. But now let's check it out in a different way. Now suppose I want this very specific paragraph, I believe it's this one, to be blue. Only this paragraph and no other one. So let's do ID equals, and you can call it whatever you want, but you're going to need to use this very specific ID that you would specify over here. Let's call this, I don't know, second para. That'll work. Okay, so let's go into our CSS. And now how do you target IDs? Do you remember? Well, from the previous tutorials, anchors, how we targeted it, we used a hashtag, remember? Now it has to be the exact same name as you had specified. So second para, as you can see, hashtag second para. Now that is the selector for IDs. It is the use of hashtags. So now let's move on to specifying what we want this specific element with this ID to have. So what would you like? Oh yeah, I remember. Let's make it color of blue, for example. So if I were to go back and everything has worked just fine, as you can see, the second paragraph, which has the ID of second para, has changed to blue. Let me just give you another example. Let's just give this an ID of, let's say, special para. Yeah, do not put spaces whatsoever. Yes, so if we were to go back into our CSS and then type in hashtag special, my God, can't spell, excuse me there. Okay, let's give this a color of yellow, for example. We'll cover more fun attributes in a moment, but we really need to nail classes and IDs. Have I saved the file? Okay, I might have made this. Oh, that is incorrect spelling, excuse me there. And oh, well, it doesn't seem to be working either. What have I done wrong? Let me just copy paste that. Also, if issues like that happen, check your spelling. It might have something to do with it. Apparently, oh no, excuse me, I made a great mistake. Do not do this. Anything inside the closing tag will not apply. Only the opening tag. So yeah, just excuse me right there. Let's go over there, and there we go. It's turned yellow. Okay, cool. And remember that. Actually, wait. Don't mind that. Let's move on to classes now. Now, classes are usually used for grouping, and IDs are only used for unique identification. That means you should use an ID only for one element. Now let's go over to classes. Now let's give this a class of, let's say, big para, and let's give this also a class of big para or something. Big para. It needs to be the exact same if you want it to be in the same group. Now don't use the terminology group, just call it a class. Now classes have a selector of dot. So you put dot and the class name. Now what is our class name? It's called big para. Let's move on. Big para. Okay, what now? So we have specified the selector of dot para, big para, excuse me, which would tell the entire page that anything with a class of big para would have these attributes we specify in between these curly braces, just to recap. So let's give this a color of green. And let me show you another fun attribute, which is font size. So font size you can give in pixels or percentage. I prefer to do it in pixels, so I think the default is 15 pixels, but let's turn that up because we want this to be a big paragraph. Let's go to 23 pixels. Let's turn it up to that level. Well, let's see what that looks like. So if it's not clear, I've done dot big para, which means dot means class and the name of the class. Okay, so let's see what that looks like. So I've given these two elements a class of big para, and I've targeted it in CSS with dot big para and give it in these attributes of color of green and font size of 23. There's a plethora of attributes out there which you could use and make a page much better, which would be in the next tutorial. However, there's one last thing I have to cover, which is the mixing of selectors. So let's try and give this element a class and an ID. So let's give this an ID of special, suppose. Now, what if you want to target this specific element? Well, all you have to do is you have to put dot big para, hashtag, because hashtag is for IDs, and whatever ID we gave it, so it should be special, and put everything you want inside here. So that's really cool, actually. Now you need to note that there should be no space between these selectors, otherwise it'll do something else which you do not want. Let's give this a font color of let's try a new one. I'm not sure. Gold. I think gold is color. Yeah. That's excuse me, I've made a huge mistake. I have this weird habit. Do not put font color. It is color only if you want to change the font color, which is a little strange, but that's how it works. Okay, cool. So now what I've done over here is I've targeted an element with a class big para and special, which is how this selector would look like. Dot big para, hashtag special. Now let's quickly go into nested elements. Now nested elements are basically elements inside elements. Now let's have a P element inside this P element with paragraph basically, and we want this to, let's type something in here like hello there, I am inside paragraph. Cool. So now what we're going to do is we're going to have paragraphs that are inside paragraphs have special attributes. Now how do we do that? Well, it's actually pretty simple. So let's do P, which basically means that target all paragraphs, and put another P, which basically means target paragraphs, all paragraphs, inside paragraphs. So that is how the selector works. Now, what do we want this to look like? Let's give it a really large font size. Let's give it a font size of, say, 40 pixels, which would be massive, but that's all right. Let's give this a color of blue, and if you want to make it bold, we can do font weight, if I can spell it hopefully, font weight bold, or you can give it a numeric value, but let's just stick with bold and see what that looks like. Hopefully it should work. So nope, didn't work. Great. What mistake have I made over here? Let me just find that out. I'll be right back once I... Hello everyone, I'm back. Excuse the mistake I made earlier. Completely ignore that last bit where I said P and P. Instead, let's take a look at nested elements in a different way. Now, we've taken a look at how the class big para changes every single P element with a class of big para. Now, suppose I have it inside another P element. Now, take a good look at this. This paragraph element is inside another one. Now, what if I want it to be a little different? Well, let's do that right now. As you can see over here, I've actually made those changes already while I was rectifying my mistake. So as you can go ahead and look over here, it will have a font size of 40 pixels, a color of blue, a font weight of bold, which means it should ideally be bolded. So let's take a look at our web page. And if I were to refresh, okay, I am inside a paragraph. Doesn't seem to be working as I expected, but you kind of get the point over here, that if you were to put a space, that means that whatever selector you put after would be inside this selector, which is before it. So that's how it works. Anyway, so that is mostly it for this tutorial. In the next tutorial, we'll be covering a lot more fun attributes that can make your page look much better. This tutorial's gist was to mainly familiarize you with the different selectors and how you can mix and match and create nested selectors and elements. Thank you very much. Hope you have it. Hope you guys found this useful. Stay tuned for the second part of this series.